Before Elizabeth's golden age and Mary's fiery return to Catholicism, England's throne flashed briefly beneath a teenage girl's trembling fingertips. Lady Jane Grey, born in 1537 with Tudor blood in her veins and Plato in her hands, was crowned Queen of England for just 9 perilous days. Groomed by Protestant reformers, coerced by ambitious parents, and propelled forward by the ruthless Duke of Northumberland, Jane's life reads like the ultimate Tudor thriller. In this deep dive documentary, we follow her extraordinary journey, the elite humanist education at Bradgate Park, the high-stakes intrigue inside Queen Katherine Parr's Chelsea household, the forced marriage to Guildford Dudley, Edward VI's last-minute devise for the succession that catapulted her onto the throne, and the unstoppable rise of Mary Tudor that dragged Jane to the scaffold on Tower Green. Join us to explore lost letters, eyewitness accounts, and rare artifacts that reveal why this brilliant scholar, who debated theology hours before her death, remains the most captivating what-if in Tudor history. In the autumn of 1537, as England hummed with jubilation over the birth of Prince Edward, the longed-for male heir to King Henry VIII, a quieter arrival took place in the serene, wooded embrace of Bradgate Park, Leicestershire. Lady Jane Grey was born into a world of privilege and peril, the eldest daughter of Henry Grey, Marquess of Dorset, later Duke of Suffolk, and Lady Frances Brandon, a formidable woman whose veins carried the blood of the Tudors as the niece of Henry VIII. Henry Grey was a man of ambition, his passions divided between the thrill of the hunt, the prestige of his lineage, and the relentless pursuit of a grander place in the royal genealogies. Frances, sharp-tongued and fiercely proud of her Tudor heritage, ensured that Jane grew up under the weight of her mother's expectations, reminded daily that her blood tied her to the throne, whether she wished it or not. In an era when noble women were groomed for marriage and deference, Jane's upbringing was extraordinary. From her earliest years, she was immersed in a rigorous education that rivaled that of any prince. Under the stern tutelage of John Aylmer, a Protestant reformer with an unyielding commitment to scholarship, Jane mastered Latin before breakfast, parsed Greek texts by midday, and recited Hebrew psalms before bedtime. Visitors to Bradgate were astonished to find the young girl, barely out of childhood, engrossed in Plato's dialogues or Aristotle's ethics, while her peers romped through the gardens, chasing dogs or playing at archery. The scholar Roger Ascham, in a now-famous encounter, found Jane reading alone and asked why she shunned the sunlight for her books. Her reply, delivered with a half-smile tinged with melancholy, revealed a truth that cut through her polished exterior. The books never pinch or taunt me. It was a fleeting glimpse into a childhood marked by her family's harsh discipline, sharp words, sharper blows, and a constant refrain that her brilliance was worthless unless it served their dynastic ambitions. Behind the serene portraits of the Grey family, Jane endured a Tudor brand of tough love, where affection was rationed and obedience was extracted at any cost. At the tender age of 10, Jane was sent to the vibrant London household of Katherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth and final queen, a woman whose intellect and diplomacy had allowed her to outmaneuver a king who sent 2 of his wives to the scaffold. Katherine, now widowed and remarried to the dashing but dangerously ambitious Thomas Seymour, presided over a Chelsea mansion that crackled with intrigue. For young Jane, it was a plunge into a world of high stakes and higher gossip, a Tudor soap opera where every glance and whisper carried weight. Seymour, a man whose charm was matched only by his recklessness, saw in Jane a valuable pawn. As a potential queen-in-waiting, she could be married to the young King Edward VI, securing Seymour's influence over the crown, or Failing that, she might serve as a bargaining chip in his schemes to control the boy king directly. Jane, wide-eyed but observant, watched as Seymour bribed palace servants, flirted scandalously with the teenage Princess Elizabeth, and orchestrated clandestine midnight visits to her chambers, all while plotting to undermine the Regency Council led by his own brother, Edward Seymour. His audacity culminated in disaster. In 1549, the council charged him with treason, and Thomas Seymour's head rolled on Tower Hill. For Jane, the spectacle of his rise and fall was a brutal lesson in the fragility of court favor. Ambition, she learned, was a flame that burned brightly but briefly, and a single misstep could snuff out not just power, but life itself. Returning to the relative quiet of Bradgate Park, Jane sought refuge in her studies as Europe convulsed under the seismic shifts of the Reformation. Martin Luther's ideas, now decades old, continued to fracture Christendom, toppling statues and shattering stained glass windows from Germany to England. In England, the religious pendulum swung wildly with each monarch's reign, torn between the old Catholic rites of Rome and the new Protestant doctrines of Geneva. When Henry VIII died in 1547, his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, ascended the throne, a frail boy draped in ermine, but guided by fervent Calvinist tutors who viewed Catholic vestments as relics of a corrupt faith. Edward's Regency Council was a nest of rivalries, dominated by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, a political predator whose cunning and ruthlessness made him a formidable player in the Tudor court. Northumberland's sharp eyes fixed on the Grey family, recognizing in Jane's Tudor bloodline a path to secure his own power. The Tudor succession, as outlined by Henry VIII's will, placed Princess Mary, a staunch Catholic, and Princess Elizabeth, a Protestant but politically inconvenient, ahead of Jane. But if Northumberland could bypass the princesses, positioning Jane as the heir, he could anchor England firmly in Protestant hands and ensure his own dominance. Jane, at 15, was the perfect candidate, devoutly Protestant, impeccably educated, legitimately tied to the royal line through her mother, yet young and pliable enough to bend to his will, or so he believed. The court's gossip mills churned with speculation as Northumberland set his plan in motion. He proposed a marriage between Jane and his fourth son, Guildford Dudley, an 18-year-old whose striking looks, tall, fair with a cascade of golden hair, were overshadowed by his arrogance and lack of empathy. Jane, fiercely independent despite her youth, recoiled at the match. She reportedly described Guildford as proud as a peacock and wept at the thought of marrying him. Her tears a rare outburst from a girl trained to suppress emotion. Her parents, Henry Grey and Frances Brandon, responded with a barrage of threats, sermons, and relentless pressure, reminding her that her duty to the family outweighed her personal desires. On May 21, 1553, Jane relented, walking down the aisle in a lavish ceremony at Durham House that bound not only her to Guildford, but 3 other dynastic couples in a single glittering spectacle. The scene was a tapestry of Tudor opulence, chandeliers dripping with silk, lutes weaving madrigals through the air, and a nervous hum of whispers as courtiers speculated on Northumberland's endgame. Jane, her slight frame weighed down by a gown that felt more like a cage than bridal finery, stood beside Guildford, whose self-assured smirk betrayed his confidence in the power this marriage would bring. Northumberland, watching from the sidelines, surveyed the hall like a general inspecting his artillery, his ambitions crystallizing with every vow exchanged. The ink on the marriage contract was barely dry when dire news swept through Whitehall. King Edward VI, long plagued by illness, was dying, his body ravaged by what was likely tuberculosis, the silent scourge of the Tudor era. Panic gripped the court. Princess Mary, as Henry VIII's eldest surviving child, was the legal heir, but to Edward's Protestant guardians, her Catholicism was anathema, conjuring visions of a Spanish-backed Inquisition. In June 1553, Edward, his strength fading, summoned his lawyers and with a trembling hand drafted his Devise for the succession. Defying his father's will, he named the Lady Jane and her heirs male as his successors, bypassing Mary and Elizabeth. Northumberland exulted. Jane's parents swelled with pride. The Devise was a legal grenade lobbed into the heart of the Tudor succession. Jane herself was not consulted, her fate sealed by men who saw her as a means to an end. On July 6th, Edward died, his death kept secret for days, as Northumberland orchestrated the transition. On July 9th, he escorted Jane to Sion House, where a delegation of bishops, nobles, and royal guards awaited. They bowed, presented Edward's Devise, and proclaimed her queen. Historical accounts describe Jane's reaction as one of shock and despair. She fainted, wept, and initially refused the crown, overwhelmed by the weight of a role she had never sought. But under a torrent of coercion, laced with biblical exhortations and appeals to divine duty, she relented, murmuring words to the effect of, "If to reign is my duty, then God's will be done." The next day, July 10th, she was conveyed to the Tower of London, a traditional rite for new monarchs, but also a fortress with a grim history of imprisoning queens. As cannons roared, trumpets blared, and crowds offered tepid cheers, a murmur of unease rippled through London streets. Was this scholarly girl, barely 16, a rightful queen or a puppet in Northumberland's power grab? As Jane's silken coronation train, a cascade of fabric embroidered with royal aspiration, dragged across the tower's iron floors, Mary Tudor, 37 and hardened by years of exile and humiliation, was galvanizing her forces in the east. Clad in crimson, she rode from manor to manor like a wildfire, her presence igniting loyalty among Catholic peasants and Protestant gentry alike. Brandishing letters that affirmed Henry VIII's will, she exposed Northumberland's ambition as a stench as foul as rotting fish. The English, ever drawn to a tale of redemption, rallied to her cause. Within days her army swelled with nobles, sheriffs, veterans of her father's wars, and half the Royal Navy, their ships pledging allegiance to the true heir. Northumberland marched out with 2,000 men to crush the rebellion, but his forces faltered. Soldiers grumbled, horses shied, and the Privy Council in London, sensing the shifting tide, lost its resolve. On July 19, 1553, the council abandoned Jane, proclaimed Mary Queen, and ordered Henry Grey to inform his daughter that her reign was over. Imagine the weight of that moment. A father who had traded his child's future for a fleeting grasp at power, crossing Tower Green to tell Jane she was no longer queen, but a prisoner. The echo of his footsteps, a requiem for their family's ambitions. Jane's reign, a mere 9 days, shorter than a modern Spotify free trial, ended as abruptly as it began. With quiet dignity, she folded her royal mantle and set aside the crown, remarking that it was too heavy, its jewels a burden she had never desired. She returned to the Tower quarters she had occupied before her proclamation, but now the door was bolted from the outside, the sound of the lock a stark reminder of her fall. Guildford, also arrested, sulked in his cell, stung not only by captivity, but by Jane's refusal to recognize him as king, a slight that bruised his ego even in defeat. Northumberland, betrayed by his peers, faced swift justice. Tried and convicted, he was beheaded on Tower Hill, his blood staining the scaffold as a warning to others. In September, Parliament reversed Edward's Devise, restoring Henry VIII's succession, and branding Jane a traitor for accepting the crown. Yet Queen Mary, in a surprising act of clemency, initially spared her young cousin. Jane was only 16, a pawn in the schemes of men like Northumberland and her father. Mary, who had endured years of exile, was reluctant to shed the blood of kin. But in the treacherous arena of Tudor politics, mercy was a fragile thing, and the specter of rebellion loomed like a hydra, ready to sprout new heads. Within the tower's stone walls, Jane retreated to her books, the one sanctuary that had never failed her. She corresponded with the Swiss reformer Heinrich Bullinger, her letters a bridge to the intellectual world beyond her cell. She debated communion theology with a precision that belied her youth, and she filled the margins of a Greek-Latin notebook, still preserved today with annotations so sharp they seem to slice through the vellum. Even her Catholic jailers, accustomed to the grim routines of imprisonment, were struck by her intellect. One guard, moved by her eloquence, admitted he had never heard Scripture quoted with such grace, her words weaving doctrine and devotion into a tapestry of conviction. Outside the tower, however, Jane's image was being reshaped by opposing forces. Catholic preachers denounced her as a Protestant Jezebel, a heretic threatening the restoration of the true faith. Meanwhile, Protestant exiles in Frankfurt and Geneva began to engrave her name in the annals of martyrdom, their pamphlets casting her as a saint in waiting. Jane was still alive, her breath misting the cold air of her cell, but her legend was already fermenting, a narrative that would outlast her. The fragile truce of Mary's mercy shattered in January 1554 with Wyatt's rebellion, a frostbitten uprising fueled by fears that Mary's betrothal to Philip II of Spain would drag England under a Catholic empire. Sir Thomas Wyatt, a Kentish gentleman, raised an army under banners proclaiming, "We are English and will not wear the Spanish yoke." Jane had no role in the conspiracy, but her father, Henry Grey, ever reckless, joined the rebels in a desperate bid to restore his family's fortunes. The rebellion collapsed swiftly. Mary's troops encircled London with cannon, crushing the insurgents and hanging their leaders from the city gates. In the aftermath, Mary's advisors, led by the iron-willed Bishop Stephen Gardiner, argued that Jane's very existence was a magnet for future plots. "The crown cannot rest while this Jane draws breath," Gardiner declared, his words sealing her fate. Mercy in Tudor politics was a candle in a gale, and Jane's light was about to be extinguished. Mary signed the death warrant with a heavy heart, her signature a reluctant acknowledgement that kinship could not outweigh the crown's demands. The Tower's staff hastily prepared a scaffold on Tower Green, sparing Jane the public humiliation of Tyburn's jeering crowds. On February 11, 1554, Jane spent her final day in prayer, her devotions a quiet act of defiance against the chaos that had engulfed her. Mary, perhaps hoping to save Jane's soul, sent Dr. John Feckenham, a renowned Catholic confessor, to persuade her to recant Protestantism. Their hours-long debate was no tearful confession, but a theological duel, witnesses likening it to a university disputation. Jane, composed and articulate, parried Feckenham's arguments with mastery, defending justification by faith, the nature of the Eucharist, and the authority of Scripture. At dawn on February 12th, Guildford was led to the scaffold first. Jane, watching from her window, saw his blonde head catch the weak morning light, followed by a crimson splash on the straw below. "Have mercy upon me, O God," she whispered, reciting Psalm 51, her voice steady despite the grief that must have gripped her. Turning to her ladies, she distributed her possessions with care, her prayer book to one, her gloves to another, her handkerchief to her attendant Mary Moon, small tokens meant to ensure her memory would endure. The climb to the scaffold was brief, but laden with symbolism. a scholar's daughter ascending a stage of violence, crafted by the ambitions of men. Jane's final words, echoing the martyr Stephen, forgave her executioners and affirmed her Protestant faith. She knelt, slipping on the blindfold, but a moment of panic flickered as her fingers groped for the block. "What shall I do? Where is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. A bystander gently guided her hand, and with one clean stroke the axe fell, a gasp rising from the small crowd as history gained a new icon painted in blood. Europe's reaction was a kaleidoscope of emotions shaped by faith and politics. The French ambassador called it the saddest spectacle ever seen, his words capturing the tragedy of a life cut short. Protestant pamphleteers smuggled woodcuts of Jane's execution across the continent, her delicate neck meeting the axe in images that fueled outrage and devotion. Catholic chroniclers, by contrast, shrugged, viewing her death as justice for a usurper. Mary, now secure on her throne, pressed forward with her Spanish marriage, a decision that would spark further unrest. Jane's parents faced divergent fates. Henry Grey, implicated in Wyatt's rebellion, was beheaded within a year. Francis Brandon, through a public apology, escaped execution, remarried a younger soldier, and retreated to obscurity in the countryside. Her tragedy is not just her death, but the lost potential of what she might have achieved. Imagine Jane in 1580, presiding over an England where scholarship and faith coexist, where her patronage fosters translations of Scripture, ignites women's education, and perhaps tempers Europe's religious wars. Such a vision is speculative, but it explains why her ghost lingers. Her agency shone brightest in her final hours, choosing words, prayers, letters, arguments, because words outlast steel. She corrected her guard's Latin, tucked a Greek New Testament into her sleeve, and faced the block quoting King David. Eyewitnesses confirmed her composure, a quiet strength that indicts the opportunists who used her. Today on Tower Green, a glass monument marks where three queens, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Jane Grey, met their ends. Tour guides recount their stories with practiced cadence. Tourists snap photos and ravens hop about, indifferent to the past. But at twilight, when London's clamor fades, you might sense a whisper, a teenage voice murmuring psalms, her words rising above the stone, refusing to be silenced.